The morning sun hung low in the sky, its golden rays slicing through the crisp air of the city park, painting long, jagged shadows across the dew-kissed grass. Birds sang faintly, their melodies weaving through the stillness, while the rhythmic thud of sneakers against pavement hummed in the distance. For most, it was just another Tuesday, a quiet start to a predictable day. But for Malcolm Hayes, it was a fleeting sanctuary, a chance to escape the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. At 38, with broad shoulders that seemed to carry more than just muscle and a jawline sharp enough to cut through pretense, Malcolm wasn't a man who faded into the scenery. His skin, a deep, polished mahogany, caught the soft light as he moved, and his dark eyes held a steady intensity that could unsettle anyone who dared to meet them too long. Dressed in faded jogging pants and a sweat-soaked gray t-shirt that clung to his frame, he looked ordinary enough, unassuming even. But beneath that simplicity was a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, a man whose every step echoed with purpose. Malcolm's breath puffed out in small clouds as he jogged along the winding gravel path, the crunch of stones beneath his feet, a steady metronome to his thoughts. He'd needed this run more than he cared to admit. The past week had been a blur of late nights at the FBI field office, poring over case files and navigating the politics that came with being one of the youngest chiefs in the agency's history. He didn't wear that title like a badge of honor. It was a tool, a means to an end. Growing up on Chicago's South Side, he'd learned early that survival wasn't a gift. It was a fight. His mother, Angela, had been his anchor, working double shifts at the hospital, her hands rough from years of labor, yet gentle when she'd tuck him in at night. "You're not where you start, Malcolm," she'd say, her voice tired but fierce. "You're what you make of it." Those words had rooted themselves deep in his soul, pulling him through the chaos of his youth, past the friends lost to the streets, past the nights he'd gone to bed hungry, past the doubts that gnawed at him in law school. They'd carried him all the way to this moment, jogging through a park that felt a world away from where he'd begun. He slowed near a weathered wooden bench, bending to stretch his aching calves. The park was peaceful, dotted with early risers, a couple coaxing their yapping terrier along, a mother pushing a stroller while sipping coffee. Malcolm inhaled deeply, letting the cool air flood his lungs. For a second, he could almost forget the nagging ache that lingered in his chest, the one that flared up every time he caught a stranger's sidelong glance or heard the subtle shift in tone when someone realized who he was, or who they assumed he wasn't. No matter how far he climbed, those reminders lingered like shadows he couldn't outrun. He knelt to retie a loose shoelace, his fingers deft and practiced, when a voice shattered the calm like a brick through a window. "Get down on your knees, now!" The command boomed across the park, raw and jagged, slicing through the morning's serenity. Malcolm froze mid-motion, his breath catching in his throat like a trapped bird. Slowly, he straightened, turning to face the source of the sound. His hands rose instinctively, palms open, a reflex born from years of navigating a world that too often saw him as a threat. Confusion swirled in his mind, clouding his sharp features. He'd been jogging, nothing more. Just a man trying to shake off the weight of his day before it even started. And now, he stood staring into the abyss of a nightmare he hadn't seen coming. The officer strode forward, his heavy boots grinding the gravel into dust with each deliberate step. He was a stocky man, his uniform stretched tight across his chest, his face flushed with authority, and something darker, something that glinted in his narrowed eyes as they raked over Malcolm. His hand hovered over the holster at his hip, fingers twitching with anticipation. "I said down!" he barked again, his voice a whip crack in the air. Malcolm's heart thudded against his rib cage, a frantic drumbeat echoing in his ears, but he held his ground. His gaze locked onto the officers, steady despite the storm raging inside him. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, his tone calm, measured, though his pulse raced like a runaway train. The officer's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes sweeping over Malcolm's sweat-drenched shirt, his worn pants, lingering as if they told a story he'd already decided to believe. "Don't play dumb with me," he spat, venom lacing every syllable. You know exactly what the problem is. Trespassing, suspicious behavior in a public park. We've had reports. Malcolm's brow furrowed, disbelief tightening his chest. I was jogging, he said, the words simple, honest, hanging in the air like a plea. The officer barked a laugh, sharp and hollow, his hand tightening around the grip of his gun. Jogging? You expect me to buy that? A guy like you, hanging around a place like this, dressed like that? Looks more like you're scoping it out to me. Around them, the park began to stir. A couple walking their dog paused, the leash slack in their hands as they whispered to each other, their eyes darting between curiosity and fear. A teenage girl, her hoodie pulled tight, slipped her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the record button before she pressed it, capturing the scene in silence. A jogger slowed his pace, earbuds dangling as he craned his neck to watch. But no one moved closer. No one spoke up. The weight of their stares pressed against Malcolm's skin, a quiet judgment that stung deeper than he'd ever admit. Sir, he began again, his voice still even, but threaded with a firmness that refused to bend. You're making a mistake. The officer lunged forward without warning, his meaty hand clamping around Malcolm's arm and twisting it behind his back with a force that sent pain searing through his shoulder. Malcolm stumbled, his knees buckling under the sudden assault, but he clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out. I'm not resisting, he said through gritted teeth, the words a lifeline to his dignity as the officer shoved him harder, forcing him down. The dirt bit into his palms as he caught himself, humiliation burning hot in his chest, spreading like wildfire through his veins. Hey! A voice called from the crowd, a young man barely 20, his voice trembling with indignation. He didn't do anything! The officer's head snapped toward him, his glare sharp enough to slice through steel. Stay out of it! He roared, his tone a blade cutting off any further protest. This man fits the description we've been given. Now back off and let me do my job. Malcolm's hands pressed harder into the ground, the grit embedding itself under his nails as he fought to steady his breathing. The whispers from the onlookers grew louder, a chorus of murmurs and gasps that weighed on him like chains. But it was the officer's next words that struck the deepest blow. Leaning in close, his breath hot and sour against Malcolm's ear, he hissed, "You don't belong here. Men like you never do." Something inside Malcolm snapped, not with a loud crack, but with a quiet, dangerous shift. He swallowed the rage boiling in his throat, his jaw tightening until it ached. "You need to let me go," he said, his voice low, controlled, but laced with a warning the officer didn't heed. The man laughed, a cruel, jagged sound that grated against the air. "Oh, do I? And what makes you think you get to tell me what to do?" Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees with a calm that belied the storm inside him. The tension thickened, heavy and suffocating, as he squared his shoulders and met the officer's gaze head-on. "I think you're making the biggest mistake of your career," he said, his words cutting through the bravado like a blade. The officer's smirk flickered, uncertainty flashing in his eyes for a split second before he shoved Malcolm again, harder this time. "You think you're somebody important?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. Malcolm didn't flinch. His hand moved to his pocket, slow and deliberate, and the officer tensed, his fingers twitching toward his weapon. But what Malcolm pulled out wasn't a threat. It was a revelation. He held up a badge, the gleaming metal catching the light, and the officer's face drained of color. "You just assaulted the chief of the FBI," Malcolm said, his voice steady, unshaken, a quiet thunder that rolled through the silence. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the park. The officer's eyes darted from the badge to Malcolm's face, disbelief crashing over him like a tidal wave. "No," he muttered, shaking his head as if he could will it away. "No, that can't be." Malcolm held the badge higher, his gaze unrelenting. "I suggest you call your supervisor," he said, his tone hard as iron. "Immediately." The murmurs erupted into a frenzy. Phones zoomed in. Cameras clicked. The teenage girl's hands shook as she filmed. The couple clutched their dog tighter. The young man who'd spoken up stared wide-eyed, pride and awe mingling in his expression. The officer's hands trembled, his authority crumbling beneath the weight of his own arrogance. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a reckoning. The humiliation he'd inflicted on Malcolm wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a mirror held up to a deeper truth, a lesson carved in the dirt of that park. Justice wasn't a gift handed down. It was a force that demanded accountability. The officer had wielded his power like a club, blind to the consequences, and now those consequences loomed larger than he could have imagined. Malcolm stood tall, his presence a testament to resilience, a reminder that no badge, no uniform, could erase the worth of a man. And as the crowd watched, breathless, the weight of that truth settled over them all. Power abused would always find its reckoning, and justice, though slow, would not be denied. Malcolm's entire body went rigid the moment the voice sliced through the air, sharp and commanding, laced with a venom he knew all too well, suspicion. "Hey, you! Stand up and step away from the bench," it barked, each word dripping with authority that demanded obedience. His muscles tensed instinctively, a jolt of adrenaline surging through him as his heart began to thud against his ribcage. He rose slowly, deliberately, his sneakers crunching against the loose gravel of the park path, and turned to face the source of that grating tone. There stood Officer Ethan Crowley, towering and wiry, his frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the bright midday sun. His hand rested casually on the holster at his hip, fingers twitching as if itching for an excuse to draw. Crowley's face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and a buzzed haircut that accentuated the stark paleness of his skin, making him look almost ghostly under the harsh light. His uniform was pristine, the creases so perfect they might have been ironed that morning, and his badge caught the sunlight with a glint that seemed to scream self-righteousness. But it was his eyes that hit Malcolm hardest, cold, piercing, and brimming with a disdain he'd encountered too many times before. They sized him up, judged him, condemned him in a single glance. "What's the problem, officer?" Malcolm asked, forcing his voice to remain even despite the heat beginning to simmer in his chest. He stood straighter, meeting Crowley's gaze, refusing to let the unease creeping up his spine show. "You're the problem!" Crowley snapped, taking a step closer, his boots thudding against the ground with deliberate menace. "What are you doing here?" The question wasn't curious. It was an accusation, delivered with a sneer that twisted his thin lips into something ugly. Malcolm blinked, caught off guard by the raw aggression radiating from the man. "I'm jogging," he replied, keeping his tone measured, though his pulse quickened. The absurdity of the situation gnawed at him. Here he was, in a public park, mid-morning, with sweat-soaked clothes clinging to his skin, and somehow that was a crime? "Jogging," Crowley echoed, his voice rising with mockery as his lips curled further. "In this neighborhood? Dressed like that? Don't play games with me." His eyes raked over Malcolm's attire, running shorts, a faded t-shirt, sneakers scuffed from months of use, and found something offensive in their simplicity, as if they were evidence of guilt rather than practicality. The heat in Malcolm's chest flared hotter, a tight coil of anger threatening to unravel, but he clamped it down with practiced restraint. "I didn't realize jogging required a dress code," he said, his words clipped but calm, a faint edge of defiance slipping through. "Watch your tone!" Crowley barked, lunging forward another step, close enough now that Malcolm could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. "I asked you a question and I expect an answer." His voice cracked with authority, but there was something unsteady beneath it, a tremor that betrayed his need to dominate. Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, to explain himself yet again, but before the words could form, Crowley's hand shot out. Rough fingers clamped around Malcolm's arm, yanking it behind his back with a twist that sent a spike of pain lancing through his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, stifling a grunt as the officer's grip tightened. "Stop resisting!" Crowley bellowed, his voice booming loud enough to echo across the park, a performance for anyone within earshot. Malcolm's jaw clenched harder, the pain radiating down his arm, but he held still. "I'm not resisting," he managed through gritted teeth, each syllable a struggle against the urge to fight back. "Get down!" Crowley snarled, and before Malcolm could brace himself, a swift kick landed behind his knee. His leg buckled, and he dropped hard, the gravel biting into his palms as he caught himself. Tiny stones pressed into his skin, sharp and unforgiving, drawing pinpricks of blood that mingled with the dirt. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, not from exertion but from the fury swelling inside him, a storm begging to break free. "Hey!" a voice rang out, sharp and indignant, cutting through the haze of Malcolm's anger. He glanced up, squinting against the sun, and saw a small crowd forming along the path. Joggers pausing mid-stride, an elderly woman with a dog tugging at its leash, a young man with earbuds dangling from his neck. "What's he doing? He didn't do anything," the voice called again, belonging to a wiry teenager in a hoodie, his phone already raised, recording. "Stay back!" Crowley shouted, his voice faltering for the first time, a slight quiver betraying the cracks in his composure. More phones emerged from the crowd, lenses glinting like accusatory eyes, capturing every move. But it didn't stop him. He leaned in close, his breath hot against Malcolm's ear, and hissed, "You don't belong here. Men like you never do." The words were venomous, personal, laced with a hatred that went beyond protocol or procedure. Malcolm's hands balled into fists, the gravel crunching beneath his knuckles as his nails dug into his palms. The anger roared louder now, a tidal wave crashing against the dam of his self-control, but he swallowed it down. Not yet. Not here. Crowley hauled him back to his feet with a rough yank, shoving him so hard he stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance. "You think you can just walk through this park like you own the place?" The officer spat, his voice rising again, feeding off his own indignation. Malcolm steadied himself, planting his feet firmly on the uneven ground. For the first time he met Crowley's eyes head-on, unflinching, and saw a flicker of hesitation in the officer's glare. He straightened his shoulders, brushing the dirt from his shirt with slow, deliberate motions, reclaiming his dignity piece by piece. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority, honed over years of facing down far worse than this. "You're making a mistake," he said simply. Crowley let out a laugh, but it was hollow, forced, the bravado slipping like sand through his fingers. "Mistake? Oh, yeah? And who the hell do you think you are?" His tone was mocking, but his eyes darted nervously, betraying the uncertainty creeping in. Malcolm didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket with a calm, measured slowness, aware of the crowd's collective breath hitching, their phones zooming closer. His fingers closed around the familiar weight of his badge, and he pulled it free, holding it aloft. The sunlight caught the golden emblem, making it gleam with undeniable authority. "Malcolm Hayes," he said, his voice steady and resonant. "Chief of the FBI." The color drained from Crowley's face in an instant, leaving him ashen, his mouth slackening as if the air had been punched out of him. The crowd erupted into a chorus of whispers, gasps rippling through them like a gust of wind. Phones tilted closer, capturing the moment his arrogance crumbled. "No," Crowley muttered, stumbling back a step, his voice barely audible. "No, that's not possible." Malcolm didn't move, his gaze locked on the officer, unyielding. "Call your supervisor," he said, the words slicing through the tension like a blade. Right now. Crowley's hands trembled as he stared at the badge, his eyes darting between the gleaming metal and Malcolm's unflinching stare. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling down his temple, and his breaths came shallow and uneven, as if he were grasping at the last threads of his unraveling control. But beneath the fear, Malcolm saw something else flicker in those pale eyes. Defiance, a stubborn refusal to surrender even now. Crowley's fingers twitched toward his radio, hesitating, as if touching it would seal his fate. The crowd pressed in, their murmurs growing into a low roar, a mix of shock and outrage fueling the air. "You're lying," Crowley hissed, his voice low and brittle, clinging to denial like a lifeline. "You're bluffing. That can't be real." "Call your supervisor," Malcolm repeated, his tone unwavering, each word a hammer striking at Crowley's crumbling facade. "Now!" Crowley's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly as his eyes flicked to the sea of faces watching him, judging him. The weight of their stares bore down like a physical force, and the phones, dozens of them, felt like loaded guns trained on his every move. With a shaky hand, he finally pressed the button on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Crowley," he said, his voice tight, strained. "I need a supervisor at my location. Immediate response." The words hung heavy in the air, a reluctant admission of defeat. Malcolm watched the shift in Crowley's stance, the cocky tilt of his shoulders gone, replaced by a rigid tension that screamed panic. The crowd sensed it too, their whispers swelling with disbelief and a growing hunger for justice. Malcolm stood firm, his eyes never leaving Crowley's, feeling the energy around him shift, building like a storm on the horizon. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You think this ends here?" Crowley muttered, so quiet only Malcolm could hear, his voice sharp with desperation. "You think flashing a badge changes anything?" Malcolm's expression remained stone cold. "What just happened is going to cost you more than you realize," he replied, his voice steady, a promise wrapped in warning. Crowley's mouth opened to retort, but the sound of tires crunching gravel silenced him. Heads turned as a black-and-white police SUV rolled to a stop nearby, dust swirling in its wake. The door swung open, and Captain Ross Garrett stepped out, his broad frame filling the space with an air of weary command. His graying hair caught the light, and deep lines etched his brow, speaking of years spent navigating the messy underbelly of power. His uniform was impeccable, every button polished, but his eyes, dark and shadowed, carried the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too much and buried even more. Malcolm knew him instantly. He'd studied Garrett's file, commendations for bravery stacked alongside whispers of brutality, a man skilled at keeping skeletons locked away. Garrett's gaze swept the scene with practiced efficiency, taking in the crowd, the phones, Crowley's rigid posture, and finally landing on Malcolm. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in his expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or frustration at the mess he'd have to clean up. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Crowley snapped to attention, his shoulders squaring as if Garrett's presence injected him with a last gasp of confidence. "This man resisted an order and became aggressive," he said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I had to take control of the situation." Malcolm stepped forward, his badge still in hand, raising it again for Garrett to see. "I'm Malcolm Hayes, chief of the FBI Criminal Division," he said, his voice firm, cutting through Crowley's flimsy defense. "And your officer assaulted me without cause." Garrett's face paled, a subtle shift that betrayed his shock. He reached out, taking the badge with a steady hand, examining it closely, its weight, its shine, its undeniable truth, before handing it back. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his tone was clipped, carefully controlled. "Chief Hayes," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I didn't realize—" "No," Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp but calm. "You didn't." Crowley's face flushed a deep crimson, his hands clenching at his sides, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Captain, I didn't know who he was," he blurted, desperation creeping into his tone. "He didn't identify himself." Malcolm turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't need to identify myself to jog in a public park," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the crowd. "I didn't need to identify myself to stand up for my rights when you decided to treat me like a criminal for no reason." The crowd stirred, their whispers growing louder, a restless energy pulsing through them. Malcolm could feel it. The outrage, the hunger for accountability, the raw power of a moment teetering on the edge of chaos. And in Crowley's eyes, he saw the lesson beginning to take root. Justice wasn't a badge or a uniform. It was a force that struck hardest when power was abused. For Crowley, the consequences were only just beginning to unfold, a reckoning that would echo far beyond this sunlit park. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone in the narrow street where the confrontation unfolded. Louder, Garrett stood at the center of it all, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as his eyes darted nervously toward the cluster of smartphones aimed at him like accusing fingers. The faint hum of voices buzzed around him, a mix of outrage and curiosity from the growing crowd, their screens flashing with every movement he made. He could feel the heat of their scrutiny burning into him, each click of a camera shutter amplifying the dread that churned in his gut. This wasn't just a bad day. It was a disaster unraveling in real time, and he knew it looked damning. "We can handle this," Garrett muttered, his voice dropping to a hushed, almost pleading tone as he turned to Malcolm Hayes, the man whose presence loomed larger than the crowd itself. "Let's step aside, Chief. We can talk this out, figure something out." His words were careful, measured, like a man trying to coax a wild animal back into its cage. But beneath the calm facade, his mind raced. How had it come to this? He'd spent years building his reputation, climbing the ranks, earning the respect of his peers, and now it teetered on the edge of collapse, all because of one reckless moment. Malcolm's response was immediate, sharp as a blade slicing through the humid air. "No!" he snapped, his dark eyes locking onto Garrett's with an intensity that made the captain flinch. "We're not stepping aside, not this time." His voice carried a weight of finality, a refusal born from years of swallowed indignities. Malcolm wasn't just angry, he was resolute, his broad frame standing tall amidst the chaos, a pillar of defiance against the storm brewing around them. Inside, his chest tightened with a mix of fury and exhaustion. He'd seen this script play out too many times before, but today, he vowed, would be different, would be... Garrett's gaze flickered, his jaw tightening as he tried to regain control of the spiraling situation. "Chief Hayes, I get it. You're upset, but we need to de-escalate this before it gets worse." His tone was placating, almost desperate, but it only fueled the fire in Malcolm's eyes. "De-escalate." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice rising with a bitter edge as he closed the distance between them. The crowd hushed, leaning in to catch every word. "You want to talk about de-escalation? Then start by owning up to what happened here. Your officer assaulted me, without reason, without provocation. He humiliated me in front of my own community, tried to break me down like I was nothing, and now you're scrambling to sweep it under the rug like it's just another Tuesday." His words dripped with accusation, each one landing like a hammer against Garrett's crumbling defenses. Inside, Malcolm's mind churned with memories, every sidelong glance, every unjust stop, every time he'd bitten his tongue to keep the peace. Not today. Garrett's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he fought to keep his composure. "That's not what's happening here," he said, his voice low and firm, though a faint tremor betrayed his unease. He wanted to believe his own words, to convince himself that this was all a misunderstanding, but the truth gnawed at him. He'd seen the footage, heard the whispers. He knew how bad it looked. It is what's happening," Malcolm shot back, cutting him off before he could spin another excuse. "And you know it. You've known it for a long time." His stare bore into Garrett, unrelenting, daring him to deny it again. The crowd murmured, their phones still raised, capturing the raw exchange as it unfolded under the flickering streetlights. From the sidelines, Officer Ethan Crowley finally broke, his voice shattering the tense air like glass. "This isn't fair!" he shouted, his pitch cracking with a mix of frustration and fear. His face was flushed, his hands trembling as he stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "I was doing my job!" Crowley's chest heaved as he spoke, his mind a chaotic swirl of panic and indignation. He'd been trained for this. Years on the beat. Countless nights patrolling these streets, making calls in the blink of an eye. But now, standing here, stripped bare by the crowd's judgment, he felt small, exposed, and utterly betrayed. Malcolm turned slowly, his cold gaze settling on Crowley like a predator sizing up its prey. "Your job?" he repeated, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable laced with disdain. "Was it your job to slam me into the pavement? To assume I was guilty before I even opened my mouth? Or maybe it was your job to make sure the people you swore to protect feel like they're walking targets in their own neighborhoods?" His words hung heavy, a quiet fury underscoring every accusation. Inside, Malcolm's heart pounded, not with fear but with a righteous clarity. He could still feel the grit of the asphalt against his cheek, the weight of Crowley's knee in his back, the sting of humiliation as onlookers watched in stunned silence. Crowley's face burned red, his lips twitching as if a dozen retorts fought to break free, but none came. He wanted to scream, to defend himself, to tell them how it felt to walk into the unknown every day, never sure who might turn on him. But under Malcolm's piercing stare, he faltered, his bravado crumbling into uncertainty. I didn't, he stammered, but Malcolm cut him off. I know enough, Malcolm said, his tone final, unyielding. And I know this isn't over. He stepped back, letting his words settle like dust after an explosion. Garrett moved forward, his hands raised in a futile attempt to wrest back control. Chief Hayes will conduct a full investigation. We'll get to the bottom of this. His voice was steady now, but his eyes betrayed the panic clawing at him. He could see his career flashing before him, decades of service unraveling in a single, ugly moment. You're damn right you will, Malcolm replied, stepping closer until their faces were mere inches apart. But you won't be the one leading it. I will. The crowd erupted, a cacophony of shouts and flashing lights swallowing the street. Garrett's shoulders stiffened, his breath catching as the reality sank in. Crowley's head dropped, his hands curling into fists as a venomous whisper slipped from his lips. You're making a mistake, Hayes. And if I go down, I'm taking you with me. His voice trembled with rage, but beneath it lay a thread of desperation, a man grasping at the last threads of a life he'd built. Malcolm didn't flinch. He turned and walked away, his footsteps steady against the cracked pavement, his mind already racing toward what came next. This wasn't the end. It was the spark of something bigger, something that would shake the foundations of everything Garrett and Crowley had known. Justice, he thought, wasn't just a word. It was a reckoning, and he'd make damn sure they felt its weight. Days later, the air in the dimly lit conference room was no less stifling. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass window, its twinkling lights a stark contrast to the suffocating tension within. Malcolm stood at one end of the long table, his reflection staring back at him, a man hardened by resolve, his dark suit crisp against the muted glow of the room. Across from him sat Garrett and Crowley, their postures rigid, their faces masks of barely concealed dread. The faint hum of the air conditioner mingled with the relentless ticking of the wall clock, each second amplifying the silence that pressed against them. Garrett cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the quiet. Chief Hayes, he began, his voice smooth but cautious, like a diplomat navigating a minefield. I think we can all agree this has spiraled out of control. Emotions ran high that night. Let's not let it define us. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled, projecting a calm he didn't feel. Inside, his stomach twisted. He'd spent sleepless nights replaying the incident, cursing Crowley's impulsiveness, cursing himself for not stepping in sooner. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his voice slicing through Garrett's plea like a knife. Stop! The word was a command, sharp and unyielding. Garrett froze, his breath catching as Malcolm continued. Don't you dare insult me by pretending this is about emotions. This is about accountability. About the fact that your officer crossed a line and you let him. His gaze was unrelenting, a storm of anger and determination swirling within. He could still hear the crowd's shouts, feel the sting of betrayal from men he'd once called colleagues. Crowley shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the table's edge. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his uniform suddenly too tight, too hot. Malcolm's attention snapped to him, his expression darkening. You've been awfully quiet, Crowley, he said, his voice low and accusing. That's surprising, considering how loud you were when you had me pinned to the ground. The memory flooded back. Crowley's barked orders, the rough hands shoving him down, the crowd's gasps echoing in his ears. Malcolm's chest tightened, but he pushed it down, channeling it into his words. Crowley's jaw clenched, his composure fracturing as he shot to his feet. You don't know what it's like out there, he snapped, his voice raw and jagged. You sit in your fancy office giving orders, but you've never been on the ground, facing real threats, making split-second calls. His hands shook, his mind a tangle of fear and defiance. He'd always seen himself as the good guy, the shield between chaos and order. But now, staring into Malcolm's unflinching eyes, that certainty wavered. Real threats? Malcolm stepped closer, his voice rising with a controlled fury. What threat was I, Crowley? Was it the sweatpants I was jogging in, the sneakers on my feet? Or maybe it was my skin that set you off? He paused, letting the question hang, watching as Crowley's mouth opened and closed, no answer forthcoming. You judged me before I even spoke. You decided I was dangerous before I had a chance to prove otherwise. And when you realized you'd screwed up, you didn't back off. You doubled down. That's not instinct, that's arrogance, and it's a danger to everyone you're supposed to serve. Crowley's face flushed crimson, his fist slamming against the table with a dull thud. I didn't know who you were, he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. Malcolm didn't move, his tone icy and resolute. And that's the problem. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. It shouldn't have taken a title for you to treat me like a human being. His words landed like blows, each one stripping away Crowley's defenses. The officer sank back into his chair, his breath ragged, his world tilting beneath him. Garrett interjected, his voice low and deliberate, a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation. Chief Hayes, we're prepared to offer a formal apology. Crowley will be suspended pending an internal review. No, Malcolm cut in, his tone brooking no argument. A suspension isn't enough. Not for this. He leaned forward, planting his hands on the table, his presence dominating the room. I want him fired. And I want an independent investigation into your department's practices. This isn't just about one bad apple. It's about the rot you've let fester under your watch. Garrett's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance breaking through his calm. You're overstepping, Hayes. No, Malcolm replied, his voice steady as steel. I'm doing my job, the one you were supposed to do. His words were a mirror, reflecting Garrett's failures back at him, and the captain's face tightened with the sting of it. Crowley surged to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. This is a witch hunt, he roared, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. You're using your power to torch my career. His fists clenched, his eyes wild as he faced Malcolm, a man unraveling before them all. Malcolm stepped back, letting Crowley's outburst echo in the room. You torched your own career the moment you abused your authority, he said, his voice calm but cutting. All I'm doing is making sure you don't get to hurt anyone else. His gaze shifted to Garrett, then back to Crowley, a silent promise that this was far from over. The door creaked open and a woman stepped in, a quiet, unassuming figure in a gray suit, her face impassive as she handed Malcolm a thick folder. She slipped out as quickly as she'd come, leaving a charged silence in her wake. Malcolm flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages with a grim satisfaction. This, he said, holding it up for them to see, is a report. Multiple complaints against Officer Crowley, misconduct, excessive force, racial profiling. All buried, all dismissed. Until now. Garrett paled, his hands gripping the table's edge, while Crowley's eyes widened in disbelief. That's not true, Crowley stammered, his voice breaking. Those were unfounded. Were they? Malcolm flipped through the pages, his tone unrelenting. Because what I see is a pattern, and that pattern ends today. He closed the folder with a snap, the sound reverberating like a gavel. Garrett leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a quiet threat. You need to be careful, Hayes. You're making powerful enemies. Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. The only ones who should be scared are the people who let this happen. And if that's you, Captain Garrett, then you'd better start worrying. His words were a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. Crowley lunged forward, his finger jabbing toward Malcolm. You think this is over? You think you can waltz in here and ruin everything I've built? His voice shook, his face contorted with a fury that masked his fear. Malcolm didn't budge. "I don't have to ruin you, Crowley. You did that yourself." His tone was steady, final, a judge passing sentence. Garrett grabbed Crowley's arm, pulling him back into his seat, his own composure fraying at the edges. Malcolm straightened his tie, his movements deliberate, a calm amidst the storm. "I'll be filing formal charges," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "And you can expect federal oversight in your department from now on. Consider this your first and last warning." He turned to leave, but Crowley's voice stopped him cold. "You'll regret this," the officer hissed, his words dripping with venom. Malcolm paused, his hand resting on the door. He turned back, his eyes locking onto theirs. "The only thing I regret," he said, his voice quiet but piercing, "is that it took this long for someone to hold you accountable." With that, he stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Garrett and Crowley in a stunned, suffocating silence. The weight of justice had descended, and it was unyielding. For Malcolm, this was more than a victory. It was a lesson carved in stone. Power unchecked breeds corruption, and the consequences, when they come, spare no one. As he walked down the hall, the city lights glinting through the windows, he knew the fight was just beginning, but he was ready. The storm hadn't broken yet. It was only just gathering strength, swirling with an electric intensity that Malcolm could feel, crackling in the air around him. He stood rooted at the far end of the cavernous lobby, his gaze locked on the towering double-glass doors that loomed like a fragile barrier between him and the chaos beyond. Through the thick panes, the faint hum of the crowd seeped in, a low, persistent buzz that grew sharper and more insistent with every tick of the clock. Flashes of camera bulbs sliced through the lobby's muted glow like lightning bolts, illuminating the scene outside in brief, blinding bursts. Protesters clutched handmade signs, their bold letters bleeding with fury and defiance, while reporters elbowed each other aside, jockeying for the perfect angle. Microphones stretched upward like skeletal hands, trembling with anticipation, all waiting for him to cross that threshold. But Malcolm didn't budge. Not yet. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, each one steadying the fire simmering inside him. Behind him, the air in the lobby thickened with unspoken tension, heavy as a storm cloud about to burst. The sharp staccato clack of polished shoes against the cold marble floor reverberated through the space, cutting through the stillness. Malcolm turned his head just enough to catch sight of Captain Garrett striding toward him, his broad frame casting a shadow that stretched long and jagged across the gleaming tiles. Garrett's face was a mask of strain, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed, his dark eyes glinting with a volatile mix of frustration and something deeper, something that bordered on desperation. A few paces behind him trailed Crowley, a diminished figure hunched under the weight of his own dread. His shoulders slumped forward as if trying to collapse into themselves, his skin pale and clammy, glistening faintly under the fluorescent lights. His eyes darted nervously, avoiding Malcolm's gaze, his lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. He looked like a man already grieving the life he could feel slipping through his fingers, a ghost haunting the edges of his own unraveling story. Garrett halted a few feet away, planting himself like a wall between Malcolm and the doors. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent murmur, as if the words were too fragile to be spoken aloud. "Hayes, you need to stop and think this through," he said, his tone steady but laced with an edge of pleading. "You step out there. You're throwing this into the public's hands. Once it's out, there's no pulling it back. Whatever control you think you've got right now, it's gone the second you let the media sink their teeth into this." His eyes searched Malcolm's face, hunting for a crack, a flicker of doubt he could pry open. But Malcolm stood still as stone, unyielding. He tilted his head just a fraction, his sharp gaze slicing into Garrett's like a blade. "You think I'm worried about control?" Malcolm replied, his voice low and even, carrying a quiet strength that filled the space between them. "This isn't about leverage, Garrett. This is about accountability, something your department seems to have forgotten exists." The words landed like a punch, and Malcolm saw the faintest twitch in Garrett's expression. A ripple of panic flashing behind those steady eyes, betraying the calm he was trying so hard to project. Garrett's face hardened, his lips pressing into a grim line as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You have no idea what you're wading into, Malcolm. You think this is just about one rotten cop? One mistake? You think Crowley's the only one who's going to crash and burn here? You're wrong. Push this and it's a landslide. It'll drag everyone down, you included." Malcolm took a single step forward, closing the gap between them, his voice growing harder, colder. "Is that supposed to make me flinch, Garrett? You think I'm afraid of the fallout?" Garrett's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin, but he didn't back down. "No," he shot back, his tone sharp now. "It's supposed to wake you up. You start this fire, and they'll dig into everything. Your past, your record, every choice you've ever made. They won't care about what's true. They'll care about what sells papers. And when they're done shredding you, you really think anyone's going to give a damn about Crowley's mess?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed, glinting with a fierce, unshakable resolve. "You think this is about saving my own skin?" he said, his voice rising with a sudden cutting edge. "You think I don't know what's on the line? My whole life, Garrett, I've been walking this tightrope, proving myself every single day, proving I belonged, that I earned my place, that I wasn't just some token hire to check a box. I clawed my way up, built everything I have, and still, I ended up eating dirt because someone like Crowley decided I didn't fit the picture. So don't you dare stand there and preach to me about consequences. I've been carrying them since the day I was born." Garrett fell silent, his gaze faltering for a moment as the weight of Malcolm's words settled over him. The fight seemed to seep out of him, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly, but before he could muster a response, Crowley lurched forward, his voice bursting out raw and ragged. "You're ruining me, Hayes!" he cried, his hands trembling at his sides, his face flushed with a desperate, wild energy. "My career, my family, everything. Do you even realize what you're doing? Do you even care?" His words cracked in the air, brittle and jagged, as he took a stumbling step closer, his eyes wide and pleading. Malcolm turned slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression a blank slate as he faced the man who'd brought him to this moment. "Do I care?" he echoed, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper that seemed to suck the air from the room. "You want to talk about caring, Crowley? Where was your care when you slammed me into the pavement? When you humiliated me in front of a crowd of strangers, gawking like I was some sideshow? When you looked at me and saw nothing but a threat to shove down?" Crowley flinched, his eyes flickering with something, guilt, maybe, or fear, as the cracks in his composure deepened. "I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice breaking, fragile as glass. Malcolm stepped closer, his presence towering now, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "And that's the whole damn point. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. It shouldn't have taken a badge to make you hesitate. You want me to cry over your career? Your reputation? What about mine? What about every single person you stepped on because they didn't have the power to fight back? Did you ever stop to care about them?" Crowley's face burned red, his fists clenching uselessly as his breath hitched. "I messed up," he choked out, his voice splintering. "I made a mistake, all right, but I'm not a bad guy." The room fell deathly quiet, the silence so thick that Crowley's ragged breathing echoed like a drumbeat. Malcolm's voice dropped low again, steady and final. "You don't get to decide that anymore," he said. "You hid behind that badge your whole career, using it like armor to excuse every wrong you ever did. But today, that armor cracked, and now you're just a man who has to face what he's done." Crowley's shoulders crumpled, his head bowing as the last flicker of defiance drained from him. Malcolm didn't look away. He held his gaze steady, letting Crowley drown in the suffocating weight of his own shame. The regret he'd spent years burying now clawing its way to the surface. Garrett stepped in again, his voice softer now, almost a plea. "We can fix this, Malcolm," he said, his hands raised slightly as if to steady the moment. "We can make it right, just not like this. Don't let your anger steer the wheel. You're better than that." Malcolm's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "This isn't about anger," he said, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the weight of a truth too long buried. "This is about justice. And if you can't tell the difference, then you're part of the problem." Garrett didn't answer. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping in quiet defeat, the fight gone from him. Without another word, Malcolm turned and shoved through the glass doors. The crowd outside exploded into a deafening roar the instant his boots hit the pavement. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions that overlapped into a chaotic tangle of noise, their microphones thrusting toward him like spears. Camera flashes erupted in a relentless storm, searing his vision with white-hot bursts. But Malcolm didn't falter. He raised the folder in his hand high above his head, his grip firm, his voice cutting through the clamor like a blade. "This," he declared, loud enough to carry over the tumult, "is the start of something bigger." The crowd roared louder, a wave of sound that crashed over him, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Malcolm felt a shift deep within, a spark igniting into something fierce and alive. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It had grown beyond him, swelling into something vast and unstoppable. As he scanned the sea of faces, some blazing with hope, others tight with anger, all brimming with a hunger for change, he knew this was only the beginning. The war was far from won, but he'd planted the first flag. Malcolm stood firm outside the precinct, the folder still clenched in his fist as the crowd's energy began to settle into a low, restless murmur. The initial tidal wave of voices had ebbed, replaced by a fog of whispered questions and curious stares. Reporters circled closer, their lenses glinting like predatory eyes. But Malcolm remained still, letting their scrutiny press against him like a physical force. His face was a mask, unreadable, resolute, though beneath it, the tension still hummed, a live wire coiled tight in his chest. Cameras clicked and whirred, microphones hovered inches from his chin, and sharp, insistent questions peppered the air. But he let them fall unanswered. His gaze drifted back to the glass doors, where Garrett and Crowley lingered like phantoms in the dim light, their distorted silhouettes framed against the reflection of the restless throng outside. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving a hollow ache in its wake, but the fire in him hadn't dimmed. He'd won this round, forced the truth into the open, but the faces in the crowd told him the real battle was just beginning. They weren't just watching him, they were waiting, expecting. They wanted more than words scratched on a page. They wanted action, accountability, a reckoning. And Malcolm felt the weight of that expectation settle over him, heavy but not crushing. He couldn't let them down, not after everything it had taken to get here. Before he could speak, the glass doors creaked open again, and Garrett emerged, stepping into the fray with a measured stride. His shoulders were squared, his expression carefully schooled into neutrality, but Malcolm could see the fractures beneath the surface, the faint tremor in his hands, the tightness around his eyes. The captain stopped a few feet away, his gaze flickering between Malcolm and the crowd, as if weighing the storm he could no longer contain. For a moment, neither man spoke, the air between them thick with the lessons of justice and the bitter cost of power misused. The crowd held its breath, and Malcolm stood taller, ready for whatever came next. Crowley's gaze darted around the room, his eyes skittering like a trapped animal's, searching every corner for a way out. His chest heaved slightly, each breath shallow and uneven, betraying the storm of panic brewing beneath his carefully polished exterior. The crowd outside pressed closer, a restless sea of bodies buzzing with anticipation. Their phones were raised like tiny beacons, lenses glinting in the harsh light, poised to capture any stumble, any crack in the facade. The air hummed with their unspoken demand for drama, for justice, or at least the spectacle of it. Malcolm stood firm, his boots planted on the scuffed linoleum floor, refusing to yield an inch as the two men approached. His broad shoulders were squared, his jaw set, and though his heart thumped steadily in his chest, his face betrayed nothing. The silence stretched taut between them, a fragile thread ready to snap. Garrett broke it first, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, low, deliberate, and edged with an authority he wore like a second skin. "We need to talk," he said. his words clipped but carrying the weight of a man who expected obedience. Malcolm didn't budge. His dark eyes locked onto Garrett's, unflinching. "We've already talked," he replied, his tone even, resonant with a quiet defiance that seemed to fill the room. He could feel the crowd's presence behind him, their collective breath held, their expectations pressing against his spine like a physical force. "Not here," Garrett shot back, his gaze flickering briefly toward the throng beyond the glass doors. His brow furrowed, a faint crease of unease betraying his otherwise composed demeanor. He wasn't just commanding now, he was pleading in his own guarded way for this to move out of the public eye. Malcolm hesitated. The weight of the moment bore down on him, heavy as the humid air clinging to the city streets outside. He could sense the crowd's hunger, their need for him to hold his ground, to be the unyielding figure they'd pinned their hopes on. But beneath that, a sharper instinct tugged at him. This wasn't the stage for the reckoning that was coming. Not yet. Without a word, he turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing faintly as he strode back into the building. Garrett and Crowley trailed behind, their shadows stretching long across the floor. The door swung shut with a deep, resonant thud, sealing them off from the clamor outside as if the world itself had been momentarily banished. The conference room felt suffocating now, its walls seeming to creep inward with every passing second. The air was thick with unspoken words, stale with the scent of burnt coffee and old paper. Garrett lowered himself into a chair, his movements deliberate, elbows planting firmly on the chipped wooden table as he leaned forward. His posture radiated control, but his fingers tapped once, twice against the surface, a fleeting sign of the tension coiling inside him. Crowley, though, couldn't sit. He lingered near the wall, arms crossed so tightly over his chest it was as if he were holding himself together by force. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched, and his eyes darted between the two men like a cornered dog unsure where the next blow would land. Malcolm stayed by the door, his back straight as a steel rod, his sharp gaze cutting through the dim light. He was a pillar of resolve, but inside his mind churned. He could feel the stakes rising, the threads of this confrontation weaving into something far larger than he'd intended. "You've made your point," Garrett began, his voice measured but laced with a simmering frustration that bubbled just beneath the surface. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasping together as if to anchor himself. "But this isn't just about you and Crowley anymore. It's bigger than that now. Don't you get it? You saw those people out there. This is about the department, the city, the trust we're supposed to uphold. And once that trust shatters, Malcolm, it's like trying to piece together a glass that's been smashed into 1,000 jagged shards, damn near impossible." "Near." Malcolm's response sliced through the room, cold and clear. "Maybe it should be broken," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady but carrying a fire that made the air crackle. "Maybe that's the only way people will finally open their eyes and see this system for what it really is." Garrett's eyes flared, a spark of anger igniting behind his careful mask. "And what exactly do you think it is?" he demanded, his tone sharpening as he rose slightly in his seat. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He took another step, closing the distance, his presence filling the room. "Rotten," he said, the word landing like a hammer on stone. "Rotten from the inside out. And if you can't see that, Garrett, then you're not just blind, you're part of the decay," Crowley snapped, his voice breaking the tense rhythm of their exchange. "That's enough," he barked, his face reddening as he lurched forward from the wall. His arms dropped to his sides, fists balled, trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about, Malcolm. You don't have a damn clue." Malcolm turned to him, his gaze icy, unrelenting. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And so do you. Don't pretend otherwise." Crowley's flush deepened, his chest heaving as years of buried guilt and pride warred within him. "I've given everything to this job," he spat, his words tumbling out in a rush, raw and ragged. "I've put my life on the line more times than I can count, dodging bullets, running into burning buildings, facing down men who'd slit my throat without a second thought. And now you're standing there, acting like I'm some monster, Like I don't deserve a shred of respect all because of one mistake. Malcolm closed the gap between them, his voice rising with a controlled fury. This isn't about one mistake, Crowley. It's about a pattern, a sick, twisted pattern that people like you have gotten away with for too long because no one had the guts to call it out. But that ends today, right here, right now. Crowley's bravado faltered, his voice cracking as he stumbled over his defense. I'm not the villain you're painting me to be, he said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. His shoulders slumped, and for a fleeting moment, Malcolm saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, yes, but also fear, and perhaps the faint shadow of shame. It was a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the badge, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Garrett leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow, weary breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. You want accountability, he said, his tone shifting to something harder, more resigned. Fine. But be careful what you wish for, Malcolm. You're not just dragging Crowley through the mud. You're setting a torch to this entire department. You ready for that? Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. Then let it burn, he said, his voice a quiet thunder that seemed to rumble through the room. Garrett's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he didn't argue. Instead, he rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate, as if testing the ground beneath him. You're not going to stop, are you? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. No, Malcolm replied, simple and final. Garrett nodded once, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone carved by years of hard choices. Then I guess we'll see how this plays out, he said, and with that, he turned and walked out, his footsteps fading into the hallway's silence. The room felt emptier without him, the air heavier still. Crowley stood motionless, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, fragile and frayed. You don't know what it's like, he said, his words trembling with a vulnerability Malcolm hadn't expected. To feel like every choice you make could be the one that gets you killed. To walk into the dark, not knowing if you'll walk out again. Malcolm's gaze softened, but the steel in his voice remained. You're right, he said, stepping closer. I don't know what that's like, but you don't know what it's like to live every day wondering if the next choice you make is the one that gets me locked up, or worse. To walk through a world where the people sworn to protect you are the ones you fear most. Crowley's eyes flickered, the fight draining from him like water through cracked earth. He sank into the nearest chair, his head dropping into his hands, fingers digging into his scalp as if he could claw away the truth pressing in on him. Malcolm watched him for a moment, then spoke again, his voice steady but laced with an unspoken challenge. You've got a choice, Crowley. Keep hiding behind excuses or step up and make this right. But either way, you're going to face the consequences of what you've done. Crowley didn't answer. He just sat there, a broken figure swallowed by the shadows of the room. Malcolm turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a thud that echoed like a gavel's strike. But as he stepped back into the lobby, the weight of the crowd's stares hit him anew. They were still there, waiting. Reporters with their microphones thrust forward, protesters with their signs held high, their chants a dull roar through the glass. Faces peered at him, some familiar, some strangers, all carrying the same desperate hope that this time, justice might prevail. Malcolm took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and determination, and stepped forward into the fray. His pulse still hammered, but it wasn't fear driving it now. It was a burning resolve, tempered by the knowledge that the real battle was only beginning. Outside, the city pulsed with life and chaos. The steps of the building were slick with the day's earlier rain, reflecting the flashing lights of cameras and the glow of street lamps. Malcolm paused against the cool wall just beyond the conference room, letting the damp concrete anchor him as he steadied his breathing. Anger simmered beneath his skin, not wild or reckless, but focused. A blade honed by years of watching power twist and corrupt. Crowley's voice still rang in his ears, the brittle edge of his defenses cracking under the weight of Malcolm's words. It would have been easy to dismiss him as just another coward in a uniform, clinging to his badge like a lifeline. But Malcolm saw deeper, saw the terror in Crowley's eyes, not just of losing his career, but of losing the man he'd convinced himself he was. And that understanding gnawed at Malcolm, a bitter thread of empathy he couldn't quite shake. Through the tall glass windows, the scene outside unfolded like a storm gathering strength. Reporters jostled for position, their voices a sharp chorus of questions slicing through the evening air. Protesters surged closer, their signs bobbing above the crowd, hand-painted pleas for justice, scrawled with fury and grief. Their chants rolled off the brick walls, a rhythmic tide of outrage that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Among them, Malcolm spotted familiar faces, people he'd seen at vigils, at marches, their eyes hollowed by too many broken promises. They looked to him now, their hope a fragile flame he wasn't sure he could shield from the wind. Footsteps broke his reverie, heavy and purposeful. Garrett emerged from the hallway, his face a mask of hard lines and shadowed resolve. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd weathered worse storms, but there was a stiffness in his stride, a tension that betrayed the burden he carried. He stopped a few feet away, arms folding across his chest as he studied Malcolm with a gaze that felt like it could peel back skin. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said, his voice low and cutting, each word sharpened by exasperation. Malcolm met his stare, unflinching. "It was already stirred," he replied, his tone steady, resonant with a truth he'd carried too long. "I just made sure people couldn't look away anymore." Garrett's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the surface, but he didn't contradict him. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, urgent and raw. "You're pushing this too far, Malcolm. Do you even see what you've unleashed? The department's a damn powder keg. The media's circling like sharks, and half the city's ready to tear it all down. You think that's progress?" Malcolm's eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "Maybe it needs to come down," he said, his voice unwavering, each syllable deliberate. "This system's broken, Garrett, rotted through. You know it as well as I do. It protects the wrong people, punishes the innocent, and lets men like Crowley walk free while the rest of us pay the price. That's not justice. That's not worth saving." Garrett exhaled sharply, dragging a hand across the back of his neck, his fingers lingering there as if to knead away the weight of Malcolm's words. "You think I don't see it?" he said, his voice quieter now, frayed at the edges. "You think I don't wake up every day knowing there's rot I can't cut out? But burning it all to ash doesn't fix it, Malcolm. It just leaves us standing in the rubble with nothing left to build on." Malcolm stepped forward, closing the distance, his voice low but fierce. "Maybe nothing is better than what we've got. A system that shields the guilty and crushes the powerless isn't something to prop up. It's something to tear apart. And if you can't see that, Garrett, then you're not just part of the problem. You're holding the damn hammer." Garrett's eyes flickered, a crack splintering through his guarded exterior. "You act like it's so easy," he said, his voice softening, tinged with a weariness that spoke of battles fought long before Malcolm ever stepped into this fight. "Like you can storm in with one case, one stand, and undo decades of damage. But it's not that clean. It's a mess, complicated, ugly, and bigger than you or me or Crowley. You're not just rattling cages, you're breaking them open." Malcolm's gaze didn't falter, but his tone eased, threading resolve with a raw honesty. "I know it's not simple. I know it's a tangled, bloody knot, and it's going to take more than one fight to unravel it. But it starts here, Garrett. It starts with holding men like Crowley accountable, not with words or promises, but with consequences. Because if we don't, the rot just spreads, and the people out there—" He gestured toward the windows, toward the crowd's restless energy. "They're the ones who keep paying for it." The lesson hung heavy between them. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above. It was a fire forged in the crucible of confrontation, a flame that demanded sacrifice, and the abuse of power, left unchecked, didn't just wound, it devoured, leaving scars on the city, the department, and the souls of those caught in its grip. Malcolm knew the cost of this stand might be everything, his career, his safety, his peace, but as he faced Garrett, then turned back toward the crowd, he embraced it. Some things were worth burning for. Garrett paced the dimly lit hallway of the precinct, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum floor, each step reverberating with the tension coiled tight in his chest. His jaw clenched as he shook his head, frustration spilling over like water breaching a dam. "You've got to realize," he said, his voice rough with exasperation, "nothing shifts if no one's brave enough to take that first leap. And right now, that leap means dragging Crowley into the light and holding him accountable for what he's done." His hands balled into fists at his sides, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "But what comes after that, Malcolm? What happens when the protests swell into something uncontrollable, when the media starts clawing through every shadow, when the whole department turns its back on you? And trust me, they will. You'll be left standing there, exposed and alone when the storm hits." Malcolm stood rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes unflinching under the flickering fluorescent lights. He didn't hesitate, didn't waver. "I won't be alone," he replied, his voice steady as granite, carrying a quiet conviction that seemed to anchor the room. "Take a look out there, Garrett." He gestured toward the grimy window behind him, where the crowd outside was growing louder, their chants rising like a tide. "Those people, they're not going anywhere, and neither am I." His gaze held Garrett's, unyielding, a man who'd already made peace with the fire he was about to walk through. Garrett turned his head, peering through the glass at the swelling mass of bodies beyond the precinct walls. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, glinting off handmade signs and determined faces. For a fleeting moment, Malcolm thought he caught something flicker in Garrett's expression. Doubt, perhaps, or the ghost of regret. But it vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by the hard lines of Garrett's weathered face. He stepped back, his voice dropping to a low, almost reluctant murmur. "You'd better brace yourself for what's coming," he warned, his tone heavy with unspoken warnings. "Because this doesn't stop with Crowley. It doesn't stop here." Malcolm's eyes never left him, sharp and resolute. "I know," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of a vow. "And I'm ready." Garrett didn't reply. He just turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing faintly as he retreated down the corridor, leaving Malcolm alone in the stillness. But the quiet was short-lived. The heavy door to the conference room creaked open, and Crowley emerged, his presence a stark contrast to the man he'd once been. His face was ashen, drained of color, his eyes sunken and shadowed, like a man who'd stared too long into an abyss. He faltered when he saw Malcolm standing there, his hesitation palpable, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he shuffled forward, each step slow and deliberate, as though the burden of his choices pressed down on every joint and muscle. When he finally spoke, his voice was a cracked whisper, barely audible over the hum of the precinct. "You win." Malcolm didn't move, didn't soften. "This was never about winning," he said, his tone even but laced with an edge of steel. Crowley's shoulders twitched, his breath hitching as his voice broke. "Then what was it about? Because from where I'm standing, it feels a hell of a lot like losing." His hands trembled at his sides, betraying the turmoil he couldn't hide. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, taking in the man before him, not the officer, not the symbol of corruption, but the fractured human being crumbling under the weight of his own actions. "It's about accountability," Malcolm said at last, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's about doing what's right, even if it's too late to undo the wreckage you've left behind." He paused, letting the words settle. "Justice isn't a prize, Crowley. It's a reckoning." Crowley's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him entirely. "I didn't mean to become this," he murmured, his voice so soft it almost dissolved into the air. "I didn't set out to be the villain in this story." His fingers twitched, restless, searching for something to hold on to. "But you did," Malcolm countered, his tone unwavering, slicing through Crowley's fragile excuses. "You became that man. And now you've got to face it." There was no malice in his words, just a cold, unyielding truth that hung between them like a guillotine. Crowley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he fought to steady himself. His hands shook more visibly now, and when he spoke again his voice was raw, pleading. What happens next? Malcolm's expression softened just a fraction, a glimmer of something human breaking through his resolve. That's up to you, he said quietly. You can dig in, fight this out, drag everyone down with you, and make it uglier than it already is. Or you can step up, own what you've done, and start clawing your way toward something better. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. The lesson here isn't just for you, Crowley. It's for everyone watching. Justice doesn't bend for power, and the consequences of abusing it don't vanish because you wish them away. Crowley's head hung lower, his frame sagging as though the words had physically struck him. For the first time, Malcolm saw something akin to surrender in the man's posture, a crack in the armor he'd worn so defiantly for so long. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Crowley lifted his eyes, his voice ragged with desperation. And if I do? If I take the fall, admit it all, does it change anything? Change? Malcolm's stare didn't falter. Maybe not for you, he said plainly. Your time for redemption might have slipped through your fingers, but it could mean something for someone else, for the people you hurt, for the ones still waiting for the system to stop shielding men like you. His words were a lifeline and a sentence all at once, offering no comfort but a sliver of purpose. Crowley didn't answer. He just nodded, a slow, weary motion before turning away. His footsteps dragged as he retreated down the hall, each one heavier than the last, until the door swung shut behind him with a dull thud. Malcolm remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the empty space Crowley had left behind. The anger still burned in his chest, but it had shifted, less wild now, more focused, a steady flame that wouldn't gutter out. He knew this wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. But as he turned toward the precinct's front doors, a faint spark flickered within him, something he hadn't felt in years, resolve unshakable and clear. And outside, the air was thick with the clamor of the crowd, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony of rage and hope. Malcolm stepped onto the precinct steps, the cold concrete solid beneath his boots, and squared his shoulders against the onslaught of flashing camera lights. The glare was relentless, stabbing into his vision, but he refused to flinch. He'd faced darker nights than this, stood against worse odds, and he wasn't about to let the weight of 1,000 eyes break him now. His gaze swept over the sea of faces, some twisted with fury, others alight with fragile optimism, and a few merely watching, curious and detached. Their expectations pressed against him, heavy as a storm cloud, demanding he speak, act, give them something to cling to in this fight that felt so much bigger than any one man. Before he could open his mouth, the door behind him groaned open again, and Garrett's voice sliced through the din, low and insistent. We need to finish this, Malcolm. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the crisp March air, his tone urgent but restrained. Now. Malcolm didn't turn. We already did, he said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd. Garrett edged nearer, his shadow falling across the steps. Not out here, he muttered, his words barely audible over the chants. Inside. Now. Finally, Malcolm pivoted, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Garrett's. You've got something to say? Say it here. Let them hear it. His voice was a challenge, daring Garrett to step into the light. Or are you scared of what they'll see when you do? Garrett's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, Malcolm thought he'd back off, retreat into the safety of the precinct's walls. But instead, Garrett leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think this wraps up with Crowley? You think pointing the finger at him fixes everything? You're blind, Malcolm. This isn't just one crooked cop, it's the whole damn system. The politics, the pressure, the machine you're kicking at. You're making enemies you can't outrun. Malcolm didn't blink. I don't give a damn about enemies, he shot back, his voice low and fierce. I care about accountability, and if that paints a target on my back, then I'll wear it proudly. His words were a gauntlet thrown down, a line drawn in the sand. Garrett's eyes flashed, his tone sharpening. You say that now with the cameras rolling and the crowd cheering. But what about when the lights go out? When the headlines dry up and they come for you in the dark? What then? Malcolm's face hardened, his resolve a wall no words could breach. Then they come, he said simply. But at least I'll know I stood for something worth fighting for. Garrett's expression cracked, just for a second, revealing a flicker of something raw beneath his stoic mask. Anger, maybe, or exhaustion. You think I don't see it? He snapped, his voice trembling with a quiet fury. You think I don't know how rotten this is? I've been in this war longer than you've had that badge pinned to your chest. But you don't fix a broken system by smashing it to pieces. You learn when to push, when to hold back. And right now, you're pushing too damn hard. Malcolm stepped closer, closing the gap between them, his voice a low growl. No, I'm pushing exactly as hard as I have to. Because men like Crowley have been hiding behind men like you for too long. Good men who look the other way, who pull back when it gets tough. I'm done waiting for the world to fix itself. Garrett's eyes darkened, but he didn't fire back. Instead, he exhaled sharply, his breath clouding in the chilly air, and stepped back. You're making a mistake, he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. Malcolm didn't waver. Then it's mine to make. Without another word, Garrett turned and vanished back into the precinct, the door slamming shut behind him with a hollow bang. Malcolm lingered on the steps, letting the roar of the crowd wash over him like a wave. Then he descended, stepping into the throng of people, their voices surging around him. A reporter broke through the chaos first, thrusting a microphone toward his face, her eyes wide with urgency. Chief Hayes, what's next? What's your plan for Officer Crowley? Malcolm didn't pause. Crowley will face discipline, he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about accountability at every level. I won't stop until everyone responsible for this culture of abuse answers for it. The crowd erupted, applause crashing against the precinct walls, but Malcolm's focus didn't waver. Another reporter shoved forward, her voice sharp. What do you say to the people who think you're overreaching, that you're letting personal feelings cloud your judgment? Malcolm's eyes flashed, his response swift and unyielding. Personal feelings? Let's get one thing straight. This isn't personal. It's systemic. And the real problem is that too many people are more upset about how I'm saying it than about the corruption that got us here. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, voices rising in agreement. This isn't about one bad cop, he continued, his tone fierce. It's about a system that props up bad cops, that lets power run unchecked. If people want to criticize me for demanding justice, let them. I'm not backing down. The reporters shouted more questions, their voices overlapping in a frantic chorus, but Malcolm's phone buzzed in his pocket, cutting through the clamor. He stepped back, raising a hand to signal his team to take over, and answered the call, his heart pounding with the weight of the fight still ahead. The air was thick with tension as Crowley stood there, his voice trembling, barely above a whisper, strained with the weight of something unsaid. I need to talk to you, he muttered, his eyes darting nervously. Malcolm felt his jaw clench instinctively, a flicker of irritation sparking within him. I think we've said enough, he replied, his tone sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. But Crowley wasn't deterred. No, he said hurriedly, almost pleading. Not about that. About something else. Malcolm paused, his mind racing, suspicion coiling tight in his chest. What could Crowley possibly have to say now after everything? What is it? He asked, his voice flat, masking the unease bubbling beneath the surface. Crowley's breath hitched, and he leaned in closer, his words dropping to a conspiratorial hush. I can't talk about it over the phone, but you need to hear this. It's about Garrett. Malcolm's stomach lurched at the name, a cold dread settling in his gut, though he fought to keep his expression steady, his voice even. Where are you? He demanded. Crowley hesitated, the faint crackle of the phone line filling the silence. Still at the station, he said finally, but not for long. Meet me in the parking garage. I'll explain everything there. Without another word, Malcolm hung up, the abrupt click echoing in his ears. Trust was a fragile thing, and Crowley hadn't earned it. Not yet, maybe not ever. But there was something in the man's voice, a raw edge of desperation that gnawed at Malcolm, hinting this wasn't just another flimsy excuse to dodge the consequences of his actions. The drive to the station felt endless, the hum of the engine a dull backdrop to the storm of thoughts swirling in Malcolm's head. What could Crowley know about Garrett? And why come clean now? The parking garage loomed ahead, a cavernous maze of concrete and shadows, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. As Malcolm pulled in, he spotted Crowley immediately, pacing near his beat-up sedan, his silhouette restless against the gray backdrop. The man looked like a ghost of himself, his face pale and drawn, his eyes rimmed red as though he hadn't slept in days. When he saw Malcolm approach, he froze, his gaze locking onto him with a mix of relief and dread. "You're not going to believe me," Crowley blurted out, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. Malcolm crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. "Try me," he said, his voice low, daring Crowley to prove himself. Crowley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to find the words. "Garrett's been covering for more than just me," he said, his voice cracking under the strain. "There's a whole network, guys on the inside keeping things buried, complaints, evidence, all of it. And Garrett's right in the middle, pulling the strings." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring deep within him. "And you knew about this?" he pressed, stepping closer, his presence towering over Crowley. The other man looked down, shame etching lines into his already haggard face. "Not at first," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But once I did, I couldn't stop it. Garrett made sure of that. He had me trapped." Malcolm's fists clenched at his sides, his patience fraying. "You're telling me this now? After everything?" Crowley's head snapped up, his voice breaking with emotion. "Because I don't have a choice anymore. I'm already finished. Done. But if this comes out, so is he. So are all of them." Malcolm held Crowley's gaze, searching those bloodshot eyes for any hint of a lie. The man's shoulders slumped, his body sagging as though the confession had drained the last of his strength. Malcolm didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them, heavy and suffocating. He could feel the weight of Crowley's words pressing down on him, sinking into his bones like a cold, unyielding truth. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning, and this moment was its first tremor. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his boots echoing against the concrete, his mind already racing with what this revelation meant, not just for Crowley, not just for Garrett, but for the entire rotting system they'd both been part of. The garage was a tomb of shadows as Malcolm returned later that night, the air thick with the faint tang of gasoline and damp concrete. Crowley was still there, leaning against his car now, his nervous energy replaced by a hollow stillness. Malcolm didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You waited until now," he said, his voice deliberate, each word laced with barely restrained fury. "To tell me this? After everything you've done, everything you've buried, and now you expect me to trust you?" Crowley flinched, his hands trembling as he shoved them into his pockets, trying to steady himself. "I know I don't deserve it," he rasped, his voice raw and broken. "I know what I've done. What I've been part of. Can't be undone. But this isn't just about me anymore. Garrett's been running this show for years, burying complaints, protecting guys like me because it kept him in power. I'm telling you because I can't carry it any longer." Malcolm stepped closer, his eyes sharp as knives, cutting through Crowley's defenses. "You had every chance to stop this before it spiraled out of control. Don't stand there pretending you've suddenly found your soul. You're only here because you're terrified. Terrified of losing your badge, your reputation, everything that props you up." Crowley's shoulders sagged further, his head bowing under the weight of Malcolm's words. "You're right," he whispered, defeated. "I was scared. But not anymore. I'm done being Garrett's pawn. If I go down for this, fine. But he's not walking away clean." Malcolm studied him, the dim light casting harsh shadows across Crowley's face. There was no bravery here, Only a man broken by his own choices, clinging to desperation like a lifeline. But desperation could be a tool, and Malcolm knew how to wield it. "If you're serious," Malcolm said, his voice steady as steel, "then you're giving me everything. Every name, every file, every dirty detail that ties Garrett to this mess." Crowley nodded quickly, his hands shaking as he fumbled for words. "I will. I'll give you all of it. But you've got to promise me something." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "You're in no position to bargain." Crowley shook his head, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need to know this matters, that it's not just about dragging Garrett down, but about fixing what's broken." Malcolm didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "It's never been about Garrett alone. It's about accountability. For him, for you, for everyone who let this fester." Crowley nodded again, his frame crumpling as though the truth had finally shattered him. The investigation that followed was a wildfire, spreading fast and fierce. Crowley delivered as promised. Hidden files, stashed in locked drawers, encrypted emails, whispered testimonies from officers too scared to speak until now. Each piece of evidence was a thread, weaving a tapestry of corruption that stretched back years, with Garrett at its center. His arrest was a thunderclap, reverberating through the precinct, shaking the walls of a department that had grown too comfortable in its silence. The news hit the city like a shockwave, and Malcolm watched as the fallout unfolded. Officers stepping forward with their own stories of buried abuses, citizens flooding the streets with demands for change. The foundation cracked, and reforms long overdue began to take root, tentative but real. Crowley didn't escape the consequences. Stripped of his badge, charged with misconduct, he stood in the courtroom with his head bowed, accepting probation and community service without a fight. Malcolm watched from the back, noting the quiet resignation in Crowley's demeanor. No excuses, no pleas for leniency. For the first time, Malcolm wondered if redemption wasn't just a fairy tale, if a man like Crowley could claw his way back from the abyss, not just for himself, but for the system that had shaped him. Garrett's fall was uglier, more brutal. The once untouchable captain faced a barrage of criminal charges, his trial a spectacle that gripped the nation. Malcolm took the stand, his voice steady as he laid bare the corruption Garrett had fought to hide. The conviction was a gavel strike heard around the world. No one was above justice, no matter how high they climbed. But the work didn't stop there. Malcolm threw himself into the aftermath, rewriting policies, retraining officers, pushing for oversight that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't flawless, and it wasn't finished, but it was a start. Standing outside the courthouse after Garrett's sentencing, he gazed at the crowd gathered below. Their faces weren't just etched with rage anymore. There was hope flickering there, a stubborn resolve, even a fragile trust he hadn't seen before. A reporter shoved through, her microphone trembling slightly as she thrust it toward him. "Chief Hayes, what do you say to those who think this is just the beginning, that there's still so much more to do?" Malcolm met her gaze, unflinching. "They're right," he said simply. "This isn't the end. It's the first step, and I'm not stopping here." The crowd roared, applause rippling through the air, and Malcolm turned away, the burden on his shoulders easing just a fraction. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, littered with battles yet to come. More Garretts lurking in the shadows, more systems resistant to change. But Malcolm wasn't alone anymore. Officers who'd once stayed silent now stood beside him, and the city's voice grew louder, unyielding. For the first time in years, that felt like enough to keep going. Justice wasn't a clean victory. It was a messy, grueling fight, a mirror held up to power's ugly face. Crowley's confession, Garrett's downfall. They were lessons carved in stone. Abuse power, and the consequences will find you, no matter how deep you bury the truth. And for Malcolm, it was a reminder that change started with the choices made in the dark, when no one else was watching. Choices to stand, to speak, to fight, even when the cost was steep.